I'm Annie Fett Cruz, Director of the Blessed Tomorrow program at Eco America. And I know while we're all turning in virtually, I am hosting from here in Vienna, Virginia, which I want to honor as the ancestral home of the Manahoic people. And I'm excited to welcome you. I extend you my peace and gratitude for joining us today. Today's episode is titled My Neighbor is Hurting, How to Serve Those Experiencing Climate Grief and Stress. And we're going to be talking to faith and mental health leaders who are working to provide guidance and support to their communities in the face of climate-related grief and anxiety. But before I introduce them, I want to share some helpful context in an opening segment we're calling Climate Quick Take. So first, I know you've all been hearing more and more about how the pandemic is feeding a mental health crisis for many people. And similarly, we are learning more and more about the mental health impacts of climate change, which often occur simultaneously with other systemic stressors like racism and economic instability. And I think as well illustrated by the recent situation in Texas, we know that when these natural disasters and extreme weather happen, there are hard numbers we use to quantify the destruction. But trauma is not always quantifiable. And I think unlike the immediate damage, it unfolds over time. So to illustrate this, I want to point to several recent reports describing the mental health impacts, particularly of wildfires. And my colleague will be sharing some of these resources in the chat. So for example, in an article in The Atlantic last summer, which was titled A Mental Health Crisis is Burning Across the American West, you can read the stories of these wildfire survivors and their ongoing difficulties. I mean, these are individuals who have lost houses, entire communities, even loved ones, and this includes a perspective from a young child. And another article titled The Long-Lasting Mental Health Effects of Wildfires, published just this past December by Outside Magazine. This article highlights not only those experiences, but also the struggles that the mental health and other service providers have had in responding to the trauma and the needs of these individuals and families. But as we'll hear today, there are many people paying attention and working to identify ways to support others and each other. And I'll share just in another article, the New York Times just a few weeks ago, it lifted up about these people, including some of our guests today who are doing research, they're offering programs and services, and creating safe sharing communities for those experiencing this kind of climate anxiety and grief. And finally, I want to point you to Eco America's own research, which I've highlighted before. And it talks about the fact that we may think we are alone in our concern about climate change, but we're really not. Nearly 75% of Americans say they are concerned about climate change, and nearly 50% of those 75% say they're very concerned. But when we ask these people if they think others are also concerned, they're reporting that only 25%. They think only 25% around them are concerned. So there's a gap. There's a gap in our perception of how others are experiencing this. And I think that demonstrates the importance of talking about this issue and acknowledging its impact on us all. So without further ado, I want to get my guests to weigh in here. So let me introduce them. We're honored to welcome Connie Burns, a licensed professional counselor who works with faith communities to process eco-grief. Dr. Jim Fleming, a practicing psychiatrist and the chair of the American Psychiatric Association's Caucus on Climate Change and Mental Health. And Rabbi Jenny Rosen, CEO and founder of Dayenu, working to advance climate solutions in many ways, but one of which is to cultivate spiritual courage among Jewish communities in the face of climate change. So hello, everyone, and thanks so much for being here. We really appreciate having you. Wonderful. All right, and I'll just remind you to unmute yourselves when you're able. So to start us off, and I think in response to what I just shared, we know that we need to help people understand that they're not alone in this concern. So how have you experienced this in your own personal lives or with those that you interact with? Just maybe I'll ask Connie to start.
Sure. I've been doing therapy. I'm a therapist for over 30 years and have been dealing with my own climate grief for a very long time, at least a few decades. And in the last decade or so, it's just gotten so much larger, both for me personally and in friends and people that I'm in practice with. And what I found was that I was feeling really kind of sunk by it. I was having trouble feeling fully alive, fully present, having my heart open. And the more grief work I did with it, the more I felt able to stay open and present. And that really kind of motivated me to start create a support group here, just of people who wanted to come together and talk about it, have safe space. And kind of from that, we started the Eco Grief circles that we're running through the Creation Care Alliance. And boy, my experience in that really dovetails with your research, that people feel like they haven't had anywhere they could talk about it. And therefore we feel alone and wonder, where's everybody else who's feeling this? So I think the conversation is really timely and important.
Jenny, what has your experience been?
First of all, thank you for convening. This is such an important conversation. So I really had my own awakening to the climate crisis, and with it, just a tremendous amount of anxiety and fear, and realizing that this was coming much faster and more furiously than I had imagined, and that without major change, that we're heading for collapse, really in my lifetime, and in certainly the lifetime of my children and future grandchildren. And I think that for me, I find that I am much more consumed with anxiety and worry and fear for whatever reason than grief. I think everybody metabolizes this differently. Worrying about what the future holds and what the present holds simultaneously. And imagining that our cities, whole countries underwater, will there be enough food to eat and water to drink and clean air to breathe? It's almost too much to fathom. And I have found that many of I run an organization called Dayenu, a Jewish call to climate action. And from the beginning, we have really centered also the spiritual dimension, because so many people are struggling with this. And I think, as we'll talk about a little bit later, I think there's also a lot of keeping it blocked, not wanting to experience that. And that creates its own angst. And one of the things that I've observed is how people experience this differently, both personally, and it can also be generational. I'd be really interested to hear from my fellow panelists, hopefully over the course of this conversation, what they're seeing across generations. At the risk of generalizing, I've observed that people who are boomers or in the greatest generations, or the last third of their lives, often are experiencing a sense of sadness and guilt about what they're leaving to the next generation, even as they're aware that they won't necessarily be here to bear the brunt of the worst of it. I think that for millennials and Gen Z kids, this is all they've ever known. And they are angry, some feel hopeless. There's even a sense for some of nihilism. And these are also the generations that are leading the way, right? With the clear voice and powerful mobilization and calling older generations to account. And then Gen X, which is where I sit, I think for us, part of it is also that the world's not as we thought it was. The narrative that we grew up with, that we could keep working and things would keep getting better and better, turned out to be completely wrong. And so I think in addition to worrying about the present and the future, we're also mourning the world as we knew it, or as we thought that it was. So I think these were obviously generalizations, but I think are another dimension of how we're all grappling with this.
Sure, and we'll dig in more, and we do hope to have further conversations and bring in other voices in the future. So please, for those participating, stay tuned. We hope this will be an ongoing discussion. Jim, please weigh in here. What has your personal experience been, and even in practice?
So that's a good question, and with all the preparation we had, and by the way, this is a very, I've told my wife this is the most organized and well-prepared webinar that I've ever been involved in. So it's a great group for folks to be connected with. I'm very impressed. And I have a number of connections, by the way, that I didn't know about. I heard about this program through the Climate Psychiatry Alliance, which is a group I've been sort of fallen into the steering committee leadership position just because I was interested in. Lisa Van Susteren, I believe, has presented in your programs, and she's in one of the recent New York Times article, was interviewed. And Lisa, turns out, went to this, was a year ahead of me at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, D.C., where I did my residency. Originally from Wisconsin. I went to Medical College of Wisconsin, the old Marquette. But and then another person, I believe Reverend Jim Antal is that spoke at one of our meetings on climate change, actually the connection between faith leaders and mental health leaders in addressing climate change. And so Reverend Jim apparently is involved on your board of this of the group that deals with climate in the 3 sectors. So I have a couple connections. But as Connie was talking, I thought, oh, are we supposed to go back and talk about? And I realized when I sort of got religion about climate change, it was when George W. Bush, the younger Bush, I think had just recently been elected. I think it was early 2000. So I would have been a psychiatrist already, 11 years or so. And I had just listened to Bill McKibben's book, The End of Nature, and I was like overwhelmed that I'd written an article in a local paper in Southeast Iowa. And President Bush said, well, United States is not going to participate in the Kyoto Protocol, way before the Paris climate. Okay, we're talking early 2000, because it might hurt our economy. And I just finished this book and I go, wait a minute, you can't, that's like, a 2-week perspective versus a 10-year or a 20-year perspective. This is wrong. So what are we going to do? I made some phone calls. Being a doctor, you kind of want to fix stuff, right? You don't just sit with those feelings for very long. He's like, what are we going to do? So I got together with some friends in this little town of southeastern Iowa, Fairfield. And we decided to connect with an environmental organization that had national and local presence. So does anybody want to guess which one it was? Oldest, one of the biggest, most
Sierra Club.
Sierra Club, bingo. So we started back. The Sierra Club had been in another town in our little area, the Thomas Hart Benton, the Aldo Leopold area group. And so we asked, it had been defunct for 10 years. So we restarted that. We moved it to Fairfield, got permission from everybody. And I've been a life member for the last few years, my wife and I, and get all kinds of good information. But in the last few years, I have been involved with the American Psychiatric Association and involved with a number of resolutions. I was in the representation of the governance committee. We might talk about that, but that's sort of how I got here. And then I'm also very involved with meditation and prayer and scripture reading on a daily basis for about almost 5 decades. So
Wow.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having us. And I mean, I'm so glad we started the session off today to share these stories, because I think that this really roots all of us, speaking together and listening together, that we all have these stories. They're different for each of us, but we all have them. And that's why we're here and doing this work. So thanks to you and thanks to the audience listening. Jim, I want to come back to you really quickly, because I think, the audience for these episodes are broad. We have faith leaders who join, we have folks from the health sector, local communities, the environmental movement, and the general public. But many may not understand how this issue of our feelings, our emotions, our processing around climate change, how that is presenting in our lives. So when you talk with other clinicians, what does this look like? How are people experiencing climate anxiety and climate grief, and what does that look like when it presents in someone's therapy session?
Well, first of all, I live in the Midwest, and we have not we've been fortunate enough to not have a lot of climate related disasters. We haven't had the wildfires. We haven't had the tornadoes. We had a deep freeze that was pretty scary that most of us in the country experienced, or many of us did. But what I have heard from my colleagues, and I'll just tell you a very brief story to illustrate this. So Lisa Van Susteren came to Washington, D.C. a couple years ago. We presented a resolution for our 38,000 member organization to divest from fossil fuels, or at least to start on that path. We didn't have a lot of them anyway. Lisa read this short statement at a, not in the main meeting where it's debated, but in the um, committee where they kind of screen it and they decide whether to support the resolution or not, the screening committee. And I was so struck by that. I'm almost coming to tears thinking about it. She deals a lot with young people, and Connie addressed this, that there's a sense of dread, this sense, it was about, I think it was 4 minutes, the little speech. I read that in front of the assembly, and the president of the APA at the time was sitting in front with some of the other people, the president-elect actually, Alpha Stewart, the first African-American president of the APA. She said, when I was reading this, she could see the affect on the 400 members, assembly members, because I was talking about how young people are having this dread and this sense of not wanting to have children, talking about rational suicide and the frustration and the sense that you can't do anything. That's where we're at. And I think Connie was maybe plugging into some of that. And I think Rabbi Jenny also. But, with, the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual is huge. And you could have anything related to any major stressor, okay? If you predispose to bipolar disorder or a psychotic disorder, that could get worse. You could trigger an episode. You could have no history of mental illness, no family history. But, if you've lost your home and you've lost your job and you've lost your spouse of 20 or 30 years or your children, it would not be normal to not be affected by that in a deep way, okay? But hopefully what we can do as clinicians and others who are in the helping professions and who are in the educational professions like Eco America is connect people with resources, connect people with other people, and help develop self-efficacy. I think that's really, I hope we can take that away from this, and maybe people can identify some ways that they feel a little bit less overwhelmed, a little bit less of that dread. Okay, that's, even if it's a little bit, you're starting down the right path.
Yeah, well, this is a perfect segue. I wanted to ask Connie, especially in the work you've been doing with the Creation Care Alliance, and Jenny with the programming you're developing at Dayenu to support the Jewish community. How do you see spiritual teaching really, just as Jim was referencing, serving to help people build that resilience in the face of something as serious as what we're talking about? And either one of you can start.
Okay, I'll start. Yeah, I just want to name that I think for many people, the spiritual aspect is part of the struggle, because it's kind of like Jim was naming. So if you're looking at the possible destruction of the planet, how do you hold that in your faith? How do you hold that in the face of a loving God? And so the spiritual struggle with this really requires people to go through the deep feelings. In the work we do, we name the sacredness of every aspect of grief. And hopelessness and despair are one of those aspects. And so as we experience courageous, safe containers where people can speak their truth, it's like if we face into those feelings and we sit with them and we digest them, what happens is we come out the other side with a larger heart, with deeper love, with a faith that's based on something much bigger than what it was based on before. And so the spiritual aspect is both really impacted by climate grief, but it is also, at least for me and for many people I know, the best large enough container to hold our distress about this, to come to a spiritual understanding that's larger than even this crisis is really, really significant in us finding a way to face into this without going into without staying in despair, without feeling like, well, what's the use then? But to find the meaning in, even if we're coming to the end of this, what's the meaning in how I live this out is a really big question. And spirituality is one of the most significant places we can chew on those questions.
Yeah, what a beautiful metaphor, that container. I love that. Jenny, how do you see this playing
Yeah.
out?
So I very much resonate with what Connie said about sort of creating a container that enables people to sit with and then move through, that it's not static and blocked. I think some of the other spiritual resources, I think that there's we talk about scripture in Jewish tradition as Torah, not just the literal Torah, but sort of the Torah of, the teaching of. And I think that there's a dimension of this that's also about the Torah of empowerment and our ability to face the pain and the grief and engage in transformation, and that it is not beyond us to do that, that it is in our capacity. And so I think there's a lot of teaching about our ability to come together and reimagine and reinvent a different kind of future that activism can then be rooted in. And the other thing that comes to mind in terms of spiritual resource is really song and music, and the way that that can fuel people's spirits and build community, and really enable people to sort of be sustained for the long haul, the work of our lifetimes.
Jim, do you want to share at all about your experiences using transcendental meditation and other practices?
Sure. And I don't know if you put my website up, but www.holisticspsychiatrykc.com, holistic with an H, not a WH. But I have a video up there. I'm getting ready to do another one. And I did that. I had on my sort of homemade cloth mask hanging underneath. So it looks, I look a little bit rough, but it was shortly after the pandemic started. And I want to put in context this because I think this is important. So I've had a lot of family challenges in the last few years, a couple of adult children with serious mental illness, one of whom I became a guardian for, I'm still a guardian for. Then my wife took a bad fall a few years ago and is just now, well, it'll be 2 years in May, is just now walking without her cane, and gave the walker back to the church. And so in a way, I had some crises that were made some distant climate disaster sort of secondary, okay? And some of my African-American colleagues are like, yeah, okay, but our very existence is threatened every time we walk on the street. So yeah, we get your climate worry, but hey, we got some other things we're worried about here for our populations. But my point is that we all need to have access to that bigger container that Connie mentioned, to that bigger perspective that I think Jenny mentioned and alluded to. And song and music is one way up to that perspective, to get that 360 degree and 10,000 foot view. What's the Psalm? Wherever I go, 139, wherever I go, you're there, bottom of the ocean, the top of the sky, wherever. But we can access, this is really important. This is really important. It's on my website, the video. I kind of address it. So there's this universality that we plug into, right, with faith? Okay. Well, it turns out if it's everywhere and it's not bound in space and time, I think maybe we're part of that, right? Obviously, logically, we're part of that. How do we get to that? How do we access that? Well, it turns out in every culture, every single civilization has a way to get to that level within, for the individual consciousness, the individual self to connect with the big self. So it turns out it's not really that hard. And maybe another time we can do an actual session. And I think Connie's gonna, or someone was gonna lead us in kind of a closing sort of meditation at some point. But
Honeywell, yeah.
If we were to give you an idea of what I teach is, I could teach a full course of transcendental meditation, but it's a little more involved and it takes 4 days, and there's a fee and all that. But it's really just the simplest form of awareness, and people can tap into that fairly simply. And that simplest form of awareness is the connection between our individual self and the infinite, the unbounded. Okay, it's the part of ourself that has not changed since Jim Fleming or Connie Burns or anyone, Anita, was 2, 5, 8, 10, 15, 20 years old, okay?
Mhm.
And in my case, 30, 40, 50, and 60. It's the same Jim Fleming. I'm tapping into that, okay? That's the stable part. And if we're able to tap into that every day, a couple times a day, it starts to seep into our day. And so when a trauma comes, we've got a bigger bank account, and the trauma is like a withdrawal. But if we've got a big bank account, our consciousness is big, it can be a pretty darn big withdrawal, and we still got reserve. Okay,
Mm.
we could call that resilience. But you gotta spend the time, and it's not hard. But you gotta set aside the time. And at
Sure.
some point, maybe we can do a little session in effortless meditation. But it's really,
I'd love that, Jim, and I'd be happy we could post it on the Blessed Tomorrow YouTube channel. And I mean, Jenny was alluding to the fact that, there's prayer, there's song, there's chant, there's just simple reflection. I mean, I know some people practice journaling, but any ways that people can kind of come back to self
right.
and then expand to whatever that higher power is or bigger picture is that you were referencing. Jenny, I want to ask you, I mean, Jim was just talking about this, and I want to acknowledge, I mean, I understand we are a panel of white people here together, and there are many, and I hope we will have future opportunities to bring in additional voices. But we've seen with the COVID pandemic, we've seen with the winter storms that these mental health impacts and physical impacts are being felt by those among us who are already the most vulnerable, and who, quite frankly, are in communities that are experiencing this for a variety of reasons and also lack adequate access to healthcare sometimes that might be supporting their ability to process and deal with their mental health issues that they might be having. So I'm curious in your work and in thinking through how faith communities can help advocate for ourselves, for our neighbors, to address these kinds of systemic inequities, and hopefully ensure we're better prepared to respond in the future. I know Diane is involved in not only the preparing communities for this, but also in advocacy work. So would you mind sharing?
Yeah, I mean, I think the devastation of COVID, the storms in Texas, and like the pain and the destruction that have been wrought are just two examples of this interconnection of COVID and climate and racism and poverty and housing. I mean, every issue coalesces around climate. And we know that the impacts of the climate crisis rest disproportionately on those who've been historically marginalized. So whether that's people living in the global south or in poverty or particularly vulnerable areas, and certainly people who've experienced racism and other forms of bigotry. I think of it as like the climate crisis is like a force multiplier. It exacerbates historical inequities, even as it impacts everyone, right? So it's none of us are exempt, regardless of wealth or skin color, but it does not affect us all equally. And I think that communities of faith can not only offer support and direct services, but also are a vehicle for building the kind of political power that we need for systemic change to happen at the scale that science and justice really demand. And I think that faith communities really, there are two, I mean, there are many ways, but I'll highlight two. One is just the important moral voice, right? The clarity that faith communities can offer around the worth of every human being and the need to ensure that everyone can live healthy lives and have their basic human needs met and live with dignity and meaning. So that moral voice, I think, is a very important role for faith communities. I also think that they're a base for community organizing and building and leveraging power with political leaders and demanding change and having the ability to re-envision and rebuild a different kind of world and really call for accountability from our leaders around that.
Connie, I know you're working at a local level, with these eco grief circles that you've been leading. And I'm curious of, how this has come up in those conversations and ways that people are exploring what they might be able to do to make an impact.
Well, in the eco grief circles, we have a lot of activists. Most of the people who've been coming are pretty involved in doing aspect of it they're called to do. But what I want to say is, I think, just to kind of dovetail on what Jenny was saying, I really feel like it's the faith communities that have large enough vision. It's like Jim was also saying, like often the political vision is so short in terms of what's important and what we're doing. And I think it's faith communities who have a large to see 7 generations down the road, or to see a more eternal picture of what's going on. And I sort of see all of these issues as interrelated in what I would call separation consciousness. That sort of idea that white men are in the image of God, and maybe other people aren't so much in the image of God, and animals aren't in the image of God, and trees aren't in the image of God. And I think it's faith communities who can really lead the transformation of how we as a whole culture approach the idea of sacredness and approach the idea of what's our tantamount value system. What are the most important things? And we need that. If we are going to surmount this crisis, we have to transform the very foundations of our cultural values. And I think it's faith traditions that have the most practice in facing into that level of perspective and connection to sacredness. And for me, it feels like that's the way through this, is to understand the sacredness of everything. And so it seems like a logical fit, but that's a really good support. And people are longing and desperate for ways to have some way to face into this, to walk through this with faith, with love, with open heart, with connection. And we have to have that big container to allow us to envision big enough to get through this. So I think the faith communities are absolutely essential in that.
I couldn't agree more. And I want to hop to a question here about, I mean, let's get specific. What are some practices that, our listeners can, even after the call today, start to explore their own personal climate grief or climate anxiety? I know you've all been working in this space, so please feel free to share some ideas. Connie, you want to start again?
Sure, I can do that. So one thing I would want to say that I have heard from a lot of people in our circles, and that I know is true for me, is paying attention to having time in nature. Our culture is so human oriented that I think often we think of resources as always either individual or collectives of people. And I think it's really helpful to be in the woods. Sometimes I'll walk through the woods and weep and say, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. And I can feel when I do that, the woods responding to me. I can feel that sacred connectedness, and that's really helpful to me. And of course, being in connection with other people who are grappling with this is one of the most powerful ways that we can find our way through it. We have to have a place where we can actually sit with, listen to, grapple with the parts of us that are in deep distress about what's going on, and having community to do that is really critical. So those are the two that I would name.
I also think of community as being sort of top of the list. This is not something we can face alone. And one of the statistics that you shared at the beginning, Annie, about how 75% of people are either concerned or very concerned, but people think it's only 25%, that experience of feeling like you're alone in this. And so the role of community, whether that's 1 or 2 people or a circle or a entire congregation, that is such an important practice. I also think that the practice of facing and sitting with the truth and the feelings. I have this image of like we throw ourselves against the closet door and just sort of like try to keep it closed because we know there's something really bad back there, and if we open it up, it's all going to come tumbling out. And I think that it's too much to take in. So we just associate, we turn away, we distract ourselves, we get busy with our lives, we watch Netflix, we have to-do lists, we have families, like whatever it is, it's like letting our souls and psyches actually begin to take it in and to sit with the devastation of what is happening and what more can be happening, and this march towards destruction. And in sitting with it, beginning to move through it. But it's circular, right? It's not like you feel it and it's one and done, right? It's an ongoing process. And that's also where community has such an important role to play. I'm sure some people are familiar with Joanna Macy's work. And she has this model of a spiral. And actually we've been piloting workshops in Jewish communities around, we call them Confronting the Climate Crisis and Cultivating Spiritual Courage, because I think there's a part of this that is also about courage. And we've based this kind of coming out of Joanna Macy's work. And she talks about this, spiral from gratitude to honoring pain, to seeing with new eyes, to going forth. And then you sort of start the cycle again and the spiral again. And whether that's the exact, matrix and spiral for a given person or community, it's more that it's this idea of movement and movement in the context of community.
And Jim, what are some practices that you would recommend? I know you shared the meditation practices, but what else?
Well, I was going to say I need 10 more seconds to describe the effortless meditation. Basically, the formula for our daily experience is threefold, three parts. I am aware of X, Y, Z, Aleph, Bet, all the different objects of perception. If we can just turn within briefly, even if we did it now for just a few seconds and close the eyes, your mind will enjoy that silence, and it'll gravitate through the natural self-reward system to a quieter place within. It feels good. And then the body will get some rest. Perspective will increase a little bit. So there's a lot that could be said about that. And from the tradition that I learned meditation from, the Vedic tradition from India, they say there's 108 ways to transcend. And it could be active. It could be like the Sufi dancing, or it could be, prayer. By the way, thank you, Jim, Jeff Spencer, for asking if we could sing together. I read that in the chat. Maybe Rabbi Jenny can lead us.
It's always hard on Zoom, but I think that might be
no, you can do it.
When we do our reflection with Connie, if you want to break out in song as well.
You can mute yourself, and
yeah, that's right.
And no one's gonna know, but you can hear the cantor. That's
right.
I find that I've been cantoring every Saturday at 4 p.m. Mass, and there's hardly any other cantors are there anymore because of concerns about COVID. And for me, that is so therapeutic, and it provides that perspective, that higher perspective. It's like, oh, that's right. I want to say a word about the connection. I was talking to Lisa Van Susteren, who we referenced earlier, about the difference in brain. And she's the one that brought this up. They've actually done functional imaging, which is live monitoring of brain function in different regions during different activities. And they've looked at, and this isn't specific to climate, but they looked at people who had depression, anxiety, just distress, and the effect of them getting engaged in some type of activity helped make things better. Okay, and I'm not talking about running away from it or trying to avoid it, but just, you're upset about what a mess your room is. Mine looks neat now, but what do you do to make it better? Well, you could sit there and kind of wallow in how messy it is, or you could start cleaning it up, right? So there's a certain, I think she said it's the right brain, a certain part of the parietal lobe, I believe, that lights up when you do something individually. When you do something collectively with a group, that it's a little bit more complicated, because you're talking to people, you're saying, well, like we do this called Free Hot Soup Independence on Sundays at a park in Kansas City for homeless. It's outreach. And I've really got into this, and it is so cool to get to know the other workers, and who's who's bringing the tables, and oh, by the way, we need this. And it's more complicated. Well, apparently the other side of the brain, the same brain structure, but on the other side, the left side lights up when we're working with community. And I think self-efficacy is really an important concept. And I have to confess, even though I had a lot of psychotherapy training back in the 1980s at St. E's, where most of my supervisors were analysts, I'm not as patient as Connie and Jenny about sitting with the grief. And I'm a little bit concerned that it can get so overwhelming that it could be immobilizing. Okay. So as a doctor, as a psychiatrist who's been doing this for 30 years, I would get engaged. I wouldn't sit with it too long. I would try to figure out what can I do? And I think what I did back in the early 2000s of getting together with some friends who had the same perspective, what are we going to do? Let's connect with something that has a national presence and a local presence. And it just happened to be Sierra Club. There's other groups. Start your own group. But if you don't have the vision, you don't have the time, you don't have the energy, connect with somebody. And it may be your faith community. It may be, and sometimes talking, this is the last thing I want to say, so give me 15 seconds. This data you mentioned, 75 or whatever majority of people concerned about climate, but most of them think that other people aren't. So chances are people in your family, your friends, your workplace are climate deniers, or they're not really, it's really not the big. Start to just kind of put out some feelers. You might find that they share some of your same concerns, and then you connect with them in a way that can be helpful.
That's great.
I would just, thank you. I would follow up just in saying that I think part of how you actually sit with it is to then move into action, right? So it's not a sitting to just dwell there, but part of how it's when you're not looking at it that I actually think people stay disengaged, right? Because it's that closet door. It's just like, let's just keep it shut. But when you open it up and you start to actually confront it, part of how you live with that is then by engaging and taking action. So I completely agree with you about the taking action part. And I also know that there are a lot of activists, and I think it sounds like Connie also encounter a lot of these people who are completely engaged in activism and don't have a space in which to process or confront or acknowledge the pain, the despair. I mean, I even feel this as a rabbi and a leader of an activist climate organization. I'm always kind of holding both the hope and the despair, right? And needing to lead from a place of hope and possibility, and acknowledging the really painful parts as well. So I don't think it's an either or. I actually think that they're very, very related to each other.
Yeah, my observation is that when we're contacting all the different feelings, like we're so much more able to respond to whatever comes up in the moment from an effective place. When we can't access our anger, it's hard to get fiercely protective. It's hard to stand up with our no. If we're not accessing the fear, it's hard to face into. If I can't deal with fear, it's hard to keep looking at the information because it feels so overwhelming. And so absolutely, I think the same thing. It's like we're much more likely to recognize and be moved toward a calling or an opportunity for action when we are actually in process with our feelings. And it's the inability to process the feelings that sort of keeps us looking away, not just from the feelings, but from the crisis itself.
I had the honor of participating in one of Connie's eco grief circles early on as you guys were piloting your curriculum. And one thing that she invited us to do is just shout the word no out loud, at our frustration with what was happening to our world. And it was one of the most powerful experiences to just be able to confront it, but with power, with a sense of agency to say no to that feeling. And I just thank you for what you're doing, Connie, with people, many of whom, like you said, are on the front lines. Well, I want to come to kind of a two-part question. We're getting a lot of questions in the chat, and one of which was, what can people be doing to help young people process this. I know we have some resources we're going to be chatting out in the chat specifically about this. But as you both, or as you all have been working with young people, are there specific things you would point people to? My second piece to that is, or anyone else, are there other resources you wanted to share, maybe specifically for youth, but for others that you want to make sure those who are participating today can check out after the webinar? I'll let anyone start.
So I would not as much name specific resources, but I think the things that we've been talking about are still the primary things. Can we listen? Can we hold space? Can we, instead of saying, oh, don't, trying to fix it, as a culture, we're so sort of ingrained with the idea if someone's in distress, make them feel better, rather than holding space for them to go through the spiral of that and come out with action, and to connect them to other young people who want to take some action. I think those are the two big things for young people, as well as any of the rest of us, is space to be able to feel and hear other people speaking to this and speak to it themselves, and then feel that there are some effective ways to take action.
I don't
Go ahead, Jim.
add to that, but except that I think, and this is why I prefer or I like interactive, and I know there's some chat. I was going to respond to someone who asked if I was a member of the Thomas Hart Benton group in Kansas City, and he's a member of Kansas, and yes, I would be part of that as a Sierra Club member automatically. But I would be interested to know where people are at, that are participating. First of all, how many are on the call? Do people have questions?
Please, anyone, you're welcome to chat questions, and also feel free to share where you're physically located, but specifically what you need, what you are looking for as you work in the space. And so I would ask, as we kind of begin to wrap up here, I want to offer Connie the opportunity to lead us all in a reflective exercise. And as people are chatting, any thoughts or ideas here as well. Is there anything you want to leave people with? I mean, I know Connie just shared this, but with the work you're doing, pointing people to ways that they can get involved. Jenny, I know you've got so much going on. Do you want to share a little bit about the programming?
Well, I would direct people to Dayenu, DAYENU.org. And we work primarily with the Jewish community, but in partnerships with lots of other communities of faith, and also other communities beyond faith communities. I think that as we've been talking about, faith communities have a particular role to play, both in a spiritual dimension and also from a advocacy and activism perspective. So I would just invite people in. I think the most important, we have this in the Bible, in the Torah, there's an idea of everyone bringing their gifts to build the tabernacle when wandering in the desert. And I think about that also in terms of the climate movement, that we all need to be bringing our gifts. And for some people, that's going to be being on the front lines. And for some people, it's going to be making the lunches for the people on the front lines. And for some people, it's going to be leading the songs and the music. And I think it's a question of really figuring out what are the gifts that you have to bring to the movement, because we need all of us, and we need all of us with our hearts open. And Connie, the way that you spoke about that in terms of love and open-heartedness, that can't come when we're holding tight in fear or when we're looking away. So I just would invite all of us to think about what are the gifts we have to bring, and how do we open our hearts to feel the complexity of feelings and the pain of the feelings, and to move through them in action in community.
Mayor Jim.
Well, thank you both, Connie and Jenny, for those thoughts. I like the idea of the gifts. That's really great. What are gifts? So my wife's a Unity minister, I'm was raised Presbyterian, became Catholic to the dismay of my mother, but with 48 years of uh, you know, TM practice and learning about the Vedic tradition, I read the Bhagavad Gita fairly often. Have pretty much the first 6 chapters memorized almost. So I'm going to leave folks with a quote, and I've presented this to my climate colleagues, climate psychiatry colleagues, who know a lot more about how bad things are than I do. Okay. You have control over action alone, never its fruits. When I said that to one of my colleagues, she was like, "Oh, that's depressing." I was like, "Whoa, wait, no. You have control over action, but you don't have control over the fruits," which in a way is okay because I'm not God. I don't know anybody who is, but I know there is one. So you have control over action, and what is mine to do. So in Unity we say, I'm going to discover what is mine to do, and then do it, and join with others and share what you're doing. Namaste.
Thank you. So it's beautiful. Connie, I want to invite you to lead us in a reflection exercise here, and then I'll wrap up and share some next steps with those who are listening. So Connie, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so just in moving toward this, I wanted to name one other thing that we haven't named, which is being present in our bodies, which this culture also is not very good at and not very good at encouraging people. So just as we begin this reflection, take a breath, and if you can, just notice your body. Notice the feeling of the breath entering and the breath leaving. And as you notice sensation, don't try to change anything. Just bring your attention. Your attention and your awareness are powerful gifts. So breathe into your body. Maybe notice your feet on the floor. And let your awareness travel down through the floor, maybe 2 floors or 3 beneath you, down into the earth. And allow your breath to send energy to connect you to the earth, to feel the roots of your energy. Your body is a part of the sacred earth, and you are connected. And with the breath, allow some of that energy to come back into your body, and notice the sensation of that. Notice if there's temperature or color associated with that energy as it enters your body. And let your breath go up to the heavens and feel those wings of energy. And allow your breath to reach up into the sky and bring some of that energy in. And feel that. And you might notice the commingling of those energies and what those feel like. And just take a moment in this place of connectedness to imagine all the other people, not just on this call today, but all the people who are working to face into this, who are working to love the planet, to embrace our grief, to find the way to transformation. And imagine that interconnection, both below, above, and all around in the circle. And allow that just for a moment to both open space and to fill you. to both let go into those spaces what wants to be released, and to bring into your body energy, connection, support. And as you notice that, just allow yourself to hear any small voice in you that might offer you right now a thought of next step for you, whether that is seeking support or offering support, noticing what your gift is that might want to be offered this day or in the days to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What a hopefully beautiful and hopeful way for us to connect with each other today and prepare ourselves to continue to do this work. Blessed Tomorrow is here for you. I really do hope that this is the beginning of an ongoing series of conversations about climate change, mental health, and the faith sector, and our role in supporting our communities, ourselves, and then activating and transforming this for action. And that's what we're here to do. And I know that's what you're all here to do as well. And so I just want to say thank you so very much to Rabbi Jenny Rosen, to Connie Burns, to Dr. Jim Fleming for joining us as our guests. We are grateful for the words that you've shared and the work that you do. This does end our time together, but I wanted to share for our listeners, please click the link to the survey when the webcast ends to provide your feedback. And if you're watching this on YouTube, right below, you can click on the description and let us know what you think. You can engage with us online using the hashtag Let's Talk Climate, and really be sure to subscribe to our newsletters so you're getting notices about the latest thought leadership resources, episodes like this, and other climate action advocacy. Specifically, check out our latest pre-recorded episode, fully in Spanish, featuring Telemundo's Vanessa Hauk and Jamie Margolin of Zero Hour, discussing climate engagement in the Latinx community. You can join us also for our next live episode on March 11th, which we will hear from leaders in Utah, talking about how they moved a conservative-leaning state to climate action. And our next faith episode will be March 25th, where we're going to hear from local faith groups on how you can advocate for climate solutions in your communities. So again, be sure to subscribe so you're getting notifications, and you can register for all of those today. So with that, thank you. From all of us at Blessed Tomorrow, your passion is important. Your commitment is absolutely needed. We are with you and we support you. And we will see you next week. Thank you, everyone.